Shh. The gavel echoed through Cook County Courtroom 302, a sharp crack that signaled the beginning of a billionaire's total ruin. Richard Sterling sat back, adjusting his custom brioni tie, a smug smile playing on his lips. He thought this divorce was a mere formality before he could jet off with his 26-year-old mistress. He thought his staggering wealth was untouchable. But across the aisle sat his wife, Maya. Stunning, brilliant, and impeccably dressed, she didn't look like a woman scorned. She looked like a predator who had just locked the cage. What Richard didn't know was that his empire was already gone. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom were closed to the public, sealing an attention so thick it felt like physical weight. Honorable Judge Patricia Davies peered over her wire-rimmed glasses, surveying the two distinct islands of power in her courtroom. On the left sat Richard Sterling, the 52-year-old titan of Chicago real estate, a man whose name was plastered across luxury high-rises from the Gold Coast to the Magnificent Mile. He projected an aura of absolute invincibility, whispering casually to his high-priced bulldog of an attorney, Jonathan Christ. Richard looked less like a man fighting for his marital assets and more like a CEO attending a minor shareholder dispute. On the right sat Maya Sterling, a striking black woman with an Ivy League pedigree and a mind like a steel trap. She sat with a spine perfectly straight, her hands folded serenely on the mahogany table, dressed in a sharply tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo. Maya radiated a chilling, untouchable calm. For 15 years, she had been the quiet engine behind Richard's success, the invisible architect who had turned his reckless investments into a calculated billion-dollar portfolio. Richard thought she was merely his beautiful, supportive wife. He was about to learn she was his sole structural support. The collapse of their marriage hadn't begun with a dramatic screaming match or a tearful confession. It began exactly 22 months ago with a careless American Express platinum charge. Maya had been reviewing the monthly expenditures for their joint family office, a task she always handled, given her background in corporate finance, when she spotted it. A $14,000 charge at the Baccarat Hotel in New York. Richard was supposed to be in London for a zoning conference. Maya hadn't cried. She hadn't thrown his custom golf clubs onto the driveway or called his mother. Instead, she had hired Thomas Thorne, an ex-FBI forensic accountant, operating out of a discreet office in Alexandria, Virginia. Within a week, the dossier was placed on her marble kitchen island. Her husband wasn't just having an affair. He had been conducting a parallel life with Chloe Harrington, a 26-year-old junior acquisitions analyst. At his own firm, there were leases signed in Richard's name for a luxury loft in Tribeca. There were receipts for Cartier bracelets and first-class tickets to the Maldives. In that quiet, sun-drenched kitchen, Maya experienced a profound, life-altering clarity. Most women would have confronted him. Most would have filed for divorce immediately, triggering the prenuptial agreement they had signed 15 years ago, when Richard's net worth was a fraction of what it was now. That prenup would have left Maya with a comfortable but tightly capped $10 million. Maya didn't want a cap. She wanted the crown. So, when Richard returned from his London trip, Maya greeted him with a warm smile and a perfectly cooked dinner. When he accidentally left his phone unlocked, exposing a text from Chloe that read, "Missing you already, boss," Maya finally confronted him, but she played the part of the devastated, desperately in love wife. The performance was masterful. She wept. She demanded couples therapy. She played on Richard's monumental ego, making him believe she simply couldn't live without him. Richard, terrified of the public relations nightmare a messy divorce would cause right before a massive IPO of his commercial division, eagerly played the repentant husband. He swore Chloe meant nothing. He swore he would do anything to earn Maya's trust back. "I need to know we are building our future together, Richard," Maya had tearfully told him during a session with their high-priced therapist in Lincoln Park. "I need to feel secure, not just emotionally, but knowing that our legacy is protected from outside threats." Driven by a toxic mix of guilt and supreme arrogance, Richard had agreed to her demands. He agreed to a post-nuptial agreement which his lawyers assured him was standard. But more importantly, to prove his transparency, he agreed to let Maya oversee a massive restructuring of Sterling Holdings LLC for estate tax optimization. Richard had spent the last 18 months completely distracted, secretly rekindling his romance with Chloe, while believing he had successfully pacified his wife. He was a man fighting on two fronts, oblivious to the fact that his wife had already drawn the map, built the battlefield, and stationed the snipers. In the courtroom, Richard shot Maya a patronizing look across the aisle. He believed today was the day he would buy his freedom. He had offered her $20 million, double the prenup, to walk away quietly. She had refused. "All rise!" the bailiff's voice boomed, snapping the courtroom to attention. Judge Davies settled into her chair, her gavel resting heavily on the sounding block. "We are here for the matter of Sterling v. Sterling. Counsel, are you ready for opening statements?" Maya's attorney, Arthur Pendleton, an older, impeccably well-mannered lawyer who looked like a gentle grandfather but litigated like a great white shark, stood up. "Ready, Your Honor? Ready, Your Honor." Jonathan Creased boomed for Richard's side. Maya kept her eyes fixed on the judge. The illusion of the graceful, forgiving wife was officially over. The execution was about to begin. Jonathan Creased took the floor first. A man known for his theatrical courtroom pacing, he approached the judge's bench with the confidence of a man holding 4 aces. "Your Honor," Creased began, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "This is a straightforward, albeit unfortunate, dissolution of a marriage. My client Richard Sterling built a real estate empire through sheer willpower, unparalleled business acumen, and decades of grueling work. We acknowledge that the marriage has suffered an irretrievable breakdown." Creased paused, turning to cast a softly disdainful glance toward Maya. However, the respondent, Mrs. Sterling, seems to operate under the delusion that she is entitled to the lion's share of a corporate entity she had no hand in building. We have an ironclad prenuptial agreement from 2011 and a postnuptial agreement from 2024. My client is a generous man. He is prepared to honor the financial stipulations of those agreements to the letter. But what we will not do, Your Honor, is allow Mrs. Sterling to plunder Sterling Holdings LLC. The company is my client's sole intellectual and financial property. Richard nodded solemnly, crossing his arms. He looked the very picture of the aggrieved, self-made titan protecting his life's work. Judge Davies made a note on her legal pad and looked toward Maya's table. "Mr. Pendleton?" "The floor is yours." Arthur Pendleton rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He didn't pace. He didn't project his voice to the rafters. He stood directly behind his chair, resting his hands lightly on the back of it. "Your Honor," Pendleton began, his tone conversational, almost casual. "Mr. Creased has painted a compelling picture of a self-made man defending his castle. There is only one minor flaw in his opening statement." Pendleton paused, looking directly at Richard for the first time. "Mr. Sterling no longer owns the castle." A muted scoff escaped Richard's lips. He leaned over to Creased, whispering loudly enough for the front row to hear. "What is this old fool talking about?" Creased just frowned, keeping his eyes on Pendleton. "To understand the current asset distribution of this marriage, Your Honor, we do not need to look at the pre-nuptial agreement," Pendleton continued, walking toward the clerk to hand over a thick, leather-bound binder. "We need to look at the corporate restructuring of Sterling Holdings LLC, executed 14 months ago. A restructuring that Mr. Sterling willingly signed, authorized, and celebrated with a champagne toast at Alina." Pendleton turned back to the center of the room. "As the court is aware, 14 months ago, Mr. Sterling sought to protect his assets from potential commercial liabilities ahead of a planned IPO. To do this, he transferred his 51% controlling voting shares of Sterling Holdings into a newly formed entity, the Sterling Legacy Trust." Odds. We are well aware of the trust, Your Honor. Creased interrupted, standing up. My client is the primary beneficiary and the managing director of the LLC that oversees that trust. This is a smokescreen. If counsel would allow me to finish, Pendleton said mildly, unbothered by the outburst. Mr. Sterling is indeed the primary beneficiary of the trust. However, a trust is only as powerful as its trustee. And who is the trustee at the Sterling Legacy Trust? Pendleton walked back to his table and picked up a single sheet of paper. According to the documents signed by Mr. Sterling on October 14th, documents drawn up during a period where he was distracted by personal endeavors outside his marriage, the sole appointed trustee with absolute, irrevocable, discretionary power over the trust's assets is an entity named Forverine Management LLC. Richard's brow furrowed. He remembered Masaverin. His lawyers had told him it was a standard Delaware shell company set up by his wealth management team to handle the administration. And Your Honor, Pendleton's voice finally gained a razor-sharp edge. Sovereign Management LLC is entirely, completely, and solely owned by Mrs. Maya Sterling. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that precedes a shockwave. Richard froze, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He turned his head slowly toward his lawyer. "Jonathan," he whispered, his voice suddenly hoarse. "Jonathan, what does that mean?" Creased was frantically flipping through his own copy of the documents, his face draining of color. "Hold on, Richard. Give me a second." "It means, Your Honor," Pendleton continued, ensuring every word landed like a hammer blow, that while Mr. Popple, Sterling is technically a beneficiary, he has zero control over his own company. Mrs. Sterling, as the absolute trustee, has the legal right to hire, fire, liquidate, sell, or restructure Sterling Holdings LLC without Mr. Sterling's consent. In fact, she doesn't even have to consult him. Objection. Creased roared, stumbling to his feet. This is a gross misrepresentation of fiduciary duty. The trustee must act in the best interest of the beneficiary. She is acting in his best interest, Pendleton countered smoothly. Mrs. Sterling has managed the trust impeccably. In fact, just last week, in her capacity as trustee, she determined that the commercial real estate market in Chicago was facing a dangerous downturn. Richard stood up, panic finally breaking through his arrogant facade. "What did you do?" he demanded, looking directly at Maya. Maya didn't flinch. She met his terrified gaze with eyes as cold as absolute zero. "To protect the beneficiary's portfolio," Pendleton announced to the room. "Mrs. Sterling initiated a hostile takeover of Sterling Holdings' 3 most profitable commercial properties, transferring their deeds into a separate offshore holding company to shield them from domestic market volatility. A holding company located in the Cayman Islands. A company entirely outside of this court's domestic jurisdiction." Judge Davies lowered her glasses, staring at Pendleton. "Counsel, are you telling me the respondent legally shifted the petitioner's billion-dollar assets offshore, utilizing his own signature?" "I am, Your Honor. Every document was notarized, witnessed, and filed legally while Mr. Benish Sterling was vacationing in St. Thing. But, with his assistant." Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed back into his heavy leather chair, the breath knocked out of his lungs. He stared at the woman he had underestimated for 15 years, the woman he had betrayed and thought he had outsmarted. Maya simply adjusted her watch, the diamonds catching the harsh fluorescent light of the courtroom. The game hadn't just begun, it was already over, and Richard was just now realizing he was the prey. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping shouts. Jonathan Creased, usually a master of composed theatrical indignation, was red in the face, his hands slamming flat against the mahogany table. Next to him, Richard Sterling looked as though all the blood had been siphoned from his body. His custom Bryony suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too large, hanging off a man who had just realized he was plummeting without a parachute. Order! Order in my courtroom, Judge Patricia Davies bellowed, striking her gavel with a ferocity that echoed like gunshots. Mr. Creased, sit down before I hold you in contempt. Mr. Pendleton, you have introduced a highly irregular, incredibly volatile dynamic into these proceedings. I suggest you explain the legal justification for your client transferring $1 billion out of the country. Arthur Pendleton, Maya's attorney, remained an island of tranquility in the storm. He adjusted his spectacles, waiting for the murmurs in the gallery to completely die down. Your Honor, the justification is firmly rooted in fiduciary duty, Pendleton explained, his voice smooth and steady. As the sole trustee of the Sterling Legacy Trust, Mrs. Sterling has a legal, binding obligation to protect the trust's assets from reckless endangerment, gross negligence, and frivolous dissipation by any party including the beneficiary himself. We contend that Mr. Sterling was engaging in behavior so financially reckless that my client had no choice but to isolate the core assets. Reckless, Creased scoffed loudly, finally finding his voice. My client is a titan of industry. He doubled the company's valuation in 3 years. This is a baseless smear to justify outright theft. Is it? Pendleton asked mildly. He turned toward the gallery. Your Honor, to demonstrate the immediate threat to the trust's financial integrity, the defense calls Miss Chloe Harrington to the stand. Richard's head snapped. No, he whispered, panic bleeding into his voice. Leave her out of this. But the heavy courtroom doors were already swinging open. Chloe Harrington walked down the center aisle, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. She was 26, undeniably beautiful, with long blonde hair and sharp, youthful features. She wore a conservative navy blue dress, clearly attempting to look professional and understated, but she was trembling. She looked exactly like what she was, a junior employee who had been playing house with a billionaire and had just been dragged into a legal slaughterhouse. Maya did not turn to look at her. She kept her eyes fixed on the judge, her expression a perfectly sculpted mask of indifference. Chloe took the stand, swore the oath with a shaking hand, and sat down. Miss Harrington, Pendleton began, approaching the podium. Could you please state your current occupation? I am a senior acquisitions analyst at Sterling Holdings, she replied, her voice small, darting nervous glances at Richard. Senior? Congratulations on the rapid promotion, Pendleton noted dryly. Miss Harrington, where do you currently reside? At the Mercer Lofts, in Tribeca. Penthouse B. A beautiful building, Pendleton said, pacing slowly. Average rent for a penthouse there is roughly $22,000 a month. A steep price for an analyst, wouldn't you agree? Who pays for this lease? Chloe swallowed hard. Richard. Mr. Master. Sterling does. Objection, Your Honor, Creased interrupted. Relevance. We concede, Mr. Sterling had an extramarital relationship. This is a divorce proceeding, not a morality play. The relevance, Your Honor, Pendleton fired back, is strictly financial. I am establishing a pattern of asset dissipation. Overruled. Proceed, Mr. Pendleton, Judge Davies said, leaning forward. Ms. Harrington, let's talk about the last 18 months, Pendleton continued, pulling a stack of glossy financial statements from his binder. During this period, the exact period Mrs. Sterling was restructuring the family assets, did Mr. Marthane Sterling purchase a 2023 Aston Martin DB11 for you? Yes, Chloe whispered. Did he fund a 6-week excursion to the Amalfi Coast for you and 3 of your friends? Yes. Yes. Did he purchase a platinum and diamond Cartier necklace valued at $140,000? Yes. Richard put his head in his hands. He had thought Maya was clueless during all of this. He had thought he was so incredibly smart, living his secret life while his wife handled the boring paperwork at home. Miss Harrington, Pendleton said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. Did you ever look at the name on the lease of your Tribeca penthouse? Or the title of that Aston Martin? Chloe looked confused. No. Richard just gave me the keys. Pendleton walked back to his table and picked up 2 documents, handing them to the bailiff to pass to the judge, and then presenting copies to Christ. If you had looked, Miss Harrington, you would have seen that Mr. Sterling did not put those assets in your name, nor did he put them in his own. For tax purposes, he purchased the vehicle and signed the lease under a corporate subsidiary named Sterling Lifestyle LLC. Pendleton paused, turning to look directly at Richard. And as of 14 months ago, Sterling Lifestyle LLC was absorbed into the Sterling Legacy Trust, which means, Ms. Harrington, your apartment, your car, and the insurance on your jewelry are technically the legal property of the trust. Chloe's eyes widened in dawning horror. She looked at Richard, but he couldn't meet her gaze. Mrs. Sterling, acting in her capacity as trustee, conducted an audit of Sterling Lifestyle LLC last week, Pendleton told the court. Upon discovering that trust assets were being occupied and utilized by an unauthorized third party, she took immediate corrective action. Pendleton turned back to Chloe, offering a polite, almost grandfatherly smile that was utterly terrifying. Miss Harrington, as of 9 a.m. this morning, the lease on Penthouse B has been legally terminated by the property owner. The locks have been changed by building management. Furthermore, the Aston Martin parked in the private garage was repossessed by a private recovery firm at 9:30 a.m. Whatever personal items you have in that apartment have been boxed up and left with the doorman. A strangled gasp escaped Chloe's throat. Tears immediately spilled over her eyelashes. She had walked into the courtroom expecting to eventually become the next Mrs. Sterling. She was walking out homeless, carless, and publicly humiliated. "You can't do that," Richard roared, leaping to his feet, pointing a trembling finger at Maya. "You vindictive." "Mr. Sterling!" Judge Davies barked. "One more outburst and you will spend the night in a holding cell." Maya, liar, slowly turned her head, finally looking at her husband. Her dark eyes were devoid of anger, devoid of sadness. They were the eyes of a woman looking at a bad investment she had just successfully liquidated. "No further questions for this witness, Your Honor," Pendleton said smoothly. "I believe we have firmly established why my client felt the urgent fiduciary need to secure the trust's heavier assets away from Mr. Sterling's reach." The courtroom took a mandatory 15-minute recess to allow emotions to cool, though the atmosphere only seemed to grow more suffocating. Chloe Harrington had fled the room in tears, escorted by a bailiff, leaving Richard Sterling sitting alone with his lawyers, breathing heavily like a cornered animal, trying to calculate a way out of a trap. When Judge Davis returned to the bench, the air crackled with anticipation. Jonathan Christ wasted no time. He was pacing aggressively, trying to claw back control of the narrative. "Your Honor, this stunt with the mistress changes nothing regarding the billion-dollar Mrs. Sterling illegally moved offshore. Being a trustee does not give you a blank check to steal. We are filing an emergency injunction to force the immediate repatriation of the funds held in the Cayman Islands. Furthermore, we demand Mrs. Sterling be removed as trustee for gross abuse of power." "A compelling argument, Mr. Christ," Judge Davies noted, looking over her glasses at Maya's table. "Mr. Pendleton, moving assets to the Cayman Islands certainly looks like an attempt to hide them from this court's jurisdiction. How do you defend this?" Pendleton stood up, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, we have no intention of hiding anything. In fact, we are fully prepared to disclose exactly what the Cayman entity Apex Sovereign Limited did with the liquid capital generated from the transfer of those commercial properties." Richard leaned forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. The commercial properties Maya had taken control of were his cash cows. They generated the liquid capital he needed to fund his riskier under-construction development projects across the Midwest. The trust didn't just hide the money in an offshore bank account to collect interest, Pendleton explained, pulling a thick, legal-sized dossier from his briefcase. Mrs. Sterling, recognizing that the Chicago real estate market was becoming over-leveraged, decided to diversify the trust's portfolio. She sought a high-yield, aggressive investment. Creased frowned, a knot of dread forming in his stomach. What did she buy? Pendleton didn't look at Creased. He looked directly at Richard. She bought debt. Richard's blood ran cold. Specifically, Pendleton continued, his voice echoing in the dead silent room, Apex Sovereign Limited utilized $600 million in liquid capital to purchase the mezzanine debt and promissory notes on Mr. Coleman Sterling's 3 ongoing domestic flagship projects, including the heavily delayed Sterling Spire in downtown Chicago. The silence in the courtroom was so profound you could hear the scratch of the court reporter's stenography machine. Let me ensure I am understanding this correctly, Mr. Pendleton, Judge Davy said, her voice laced with absolute astonishment. The respondent used the trust's money to buy the petitioner's corporate debt from his lenders? Exactly, Your Honor, Pendleton said. The original lenders, a syndicate of 3 major national banks, were growing incredibly nervous about the delays and cost overruns on the Sterling Spire. When Apex Sovereign Limited offered to buy the debt from them at a slight premium, they eagerly offloaded the risk. Richard felt the room spinning. He grabbed the edge of the table to steady himself. What does this mean? Creased hissed to Richard, grabbing his arm. Richard, talk to me. What does she hold? Richard couldn't speak. His jaw was locked. He knew exactly what she held. For the benefit of opposing counsel, Pendleton offered graciously, it means that the banks are no longer Mr. Sterling's creditors. Apex Sovereign Limited, a company entirely controlled by Mrs. Sterling, is now the sole holder of Mr. Astra Sterling's debt on his remaining domestic empire. This is absurd, Creased shouted, waving his hands. So what? My client will just make his loan payments to her instead of the bank. It doesn't change his ownership of the buildings. It would, Pendleton agreed softly, if Mr. Sterling were capable of making those payments. Pendleton walked over to the clerk, handing over the final, devastating piece of paper. Unfortunately, Your Honor, Mr. Sterling relied heavily on the cash flow from the 3 commercial properties that Mrs. Sterling rightfully transferred into the trust. Without that cash flow, Mr. Sterling's domestic accounts have been starved of liquidity for the past 30 days. As of midnight last night, Mr. Sterling missed a $40 million balloon payment on the Sterling Spire. You engineered a default, Richard screamed, his voice cracking, losing every shred of his billionaire composure. You stole my cash flow so I couldn't pay my own loans. Mrs. Sterling merely protected the trust's assets, Pendleton replied smoothly. The fact that your domestic shell companies were over-leveraged and underfunded is a consequence of your own poor financial management, Mr. Sterling. The trust cannot be held responsible for your domestic liquidity crisis. Pendleton turned back to the judge. Because Mr. Sterling is now in default, Apex Sovereign Limited has exercised its right to accelerate the loan. The entire balance of $600 million is due immediately. He doesn't have $600 million in liquid capital. Creased argued, finally realizing the sheer terrifying scope of the trap. You know he doesn't. We are aware, Pendleton nodded calmly. Which is why, per the terms of the original loan agreement signed by Mr. Sterling, Apex Sovereign Limited has initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Sterling Spire, the 2 luxury developments in Ohio, and, crucially, Mr. Sterling's personal guarantees. Richard let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. The personal guarantees. To get the loans from the banks in the first place, he had to put up his remaining personal assets as collateral. His mansions, his private jet, his art collection. Maya hadn't just taken half in a divorce by legally transferring the safe assets into a trust she controlled, and then using that money to buy the debt of his risky assets. She had positioned herself to legally consume everything he had ever built. She wasn't just divorcing him. She was foreclosing on his entire life. Maya finally shifted in her chair. She uncrossed her legs, resting her hands lightly on the table, and turned to look at the man who had promised her the world while secretly giving pieces of it to a 26-year-old. "I told you, Richard," Maya said, her voice cutting through the courtroom, soft, melodic, and devastatingly cold. "I needed to know our legacy was protected from outside threats. You just didn't realize that the threat was you, not I." The heavy silence in Cook County Courtroom 302 was suffocating, broken only by the ragged, shallow breathing of Richard Sterling. The man who had walked into the room 2 hours ago as a titan of Chicago real estate now looked like a hollowed-out shell. He stared at his wife Maya, his eyes wide with a terrifying mixture of betrayal and profound disbelief. Jonathan Christ, Richard's high-priced attorney, was frantically wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. His usual theatrical bluster had completely evaporated. He was no longer trying to win a divorce settlement. He was trying to stop a total financial annihilation. "Your Honor, we need a recess," Christ stammered, his voice lacking its previous boom. "We need time to review these hostile maneuvers. We are prepared to file an emergency Chapter 11 bankruptcy petition for the Sterling Spire and the associated development LLCs. That will place an immediate automatic stay on any foreclosure proceedings initiated by Mrs. Butt, Sterling's offshore entity." Richard nodded frantically, grasping onto this lifeline. Bankruptcy would tie up the assets in federal court for years. It would give him time to breathe, to fight back, to restructure. Maya's attorney, Arthur Pendleton, didn't even look up from the leather binder on his desk. He simply turned a page. "I am afraid that Avenue has already been permanently closed, Your Honor," Pendleton said, his voice carrying the gentle, instructional tone of a professor correcting a failing student. "If Mr. Pye," Christ would refer to page 42, Section 8, Paragraph C of the Sterling Legacy Trust Agreement, the very agreement his client signed 14 months ago. Christ's hands shook as he flipped furiously through his copy of the documents. "As the absolute trustee," Pendleton continued, "Mrs. Sterling holds the exclusive, unilateral right to authorize or prohibit any bankruptcy filings for all subsidiary LLCs operating under the trust umbrella." Mr. Sterling explicitly waived his right to file for Chapter 11 protection without her notarized written consent, a consent she formally declined to grant yesterday afternoon. "You waived your right to declare bankruptcy?" Judge Patricia Davies asked, her eyebrows shooting up toward her hairline. She looked at Richard with a mix of professional astonishment and sheer pity. "Mr. Sterling, did you read any of these documents before you signed them?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He hadn't read them. Not thoroughly, anyway. He had been too busy coordinating a secret weekend trip to Aspen with Chloe Harrington. He had seen the top pages, seen his own lawyer's initials on the draft's lawyers, who, it turned out, had been primarily communicating with Maya, since she handled all the tedious family office administration. He had trusted his wife to manage the paperwork, just as she always had. "It's a fraudulent inducement, Your Honor," Christ shouted, slamming his fist on the table. "She tricked him into signing away his corporate autonomy under the guise of estate planning." "There was no trickery, Your Honor," Pendleton countered smoothly. "Every document was drafted legally, reviewed by Mr. Sterling's own corporate counsel, and signed in the presence of a notary. Mr. Sterling is a 52-year-old billionaire who has executed hundreds of complex corporate mergers. He cannot suddenly claim legal ignorance simply because his wife out-negotiated him in his own boardroom." Judge Davis adjusted her glasses, peering down at the frantic defense table. "Mr. Pendleton is correct, Counselor. Your client is a sophisticated, seasoned businessman. The court cannot void a legally binding corporate restructure just because the petitioner failed to do his due diligence." "The Richard's chest heaved. He looked at Maya, his perfectly manicured hands clenching into tight, white-knuckled fists. "The personal guarantees," he whispered, his voice cracking. Maya, the personal guarantees. If you foreclose on the spire, the banks, you take the houses, you take everything. Maya finally turned to him, her expression a masterclass in absolute chilling composure. I am not taking anything, Richard. Apex Sovereign Limited is simply exercising its contractual rights as the senior creditor. Apex is you. Richard screamed, the veneer of civilization finally snapping. It's you. You're stripping me to the bone. The house in Winnetka? The bombardier jet? You know I put those up as collateral. Where am I supposed to live, Maya? What am I supposed to do? Perhaps you could ask your junior analyst for a place to stay, Maya replied, her voice soft, yet it carried across the courtroom like the crack of a whip. Oh wait, I cancelled her lease this morning. You vindictive! Richard lunged forward, but creased in the courtroom bailiff immediately forced him back into his chair. Mr. Sterling. Judge Davies barked, her gavel slamming down hard. Control yourself, or I will have you removed and you can watch the rest of this financial autopsy from a cell. Richard slumped back, burying his face in his hands. We built this together, he mumbled, his voice muffled by his palms. 15 years, Maya. We built this together. And you can't just erase me. I didn't erase you, Richard, Maya said, her dark eyes locking onto him, entirely devoid of pity. 15 years ago, you were deeply in debt, flipping mid-level apartment complexes. I brought the financial strategy. I structured your tax shelters. I optimized your acquisitions. I built the foundation while you played the charming face of the company. I asked you for one thing in return: loyalty. You breached that contract, so I am simply repossessing my intellectual property. There is the matter of the Zurich accounts, Your Honor, Pendleton interjected, refusing to let the momentum slow for even a second. Richard's head snapped up, a fresh wave of terror washing over his face. Suresh? Creased asked, looking at his client. Richard, what Zurich accounts? You didn't disclose any Swiss accounts to me. Pendleton offered a polite, devastating smile. It appears Mr. Sterling was attempting to hide a rainy day fund from both his wife and his legal counsel. Over the past 3 years, Mr. Sterling quietly funneled roughly $45 million into a numbered account at UBS in Switzerland. Objection! Creased yelled, trying to salvage the wreckage. If my client has undisclosed accounts, that is a matter for discovery, not this proceeding. It would be, Pendleton agreed, if the money were still there. The entire courtroom seemed to lean in at once. When Mrs. Sterling initiated her audit as the trustee of the family office, Pendleton explained, holding up a fresh set of bank transcripts, she discovered the wire transfers. Because those funds were marital assets secretly siphoned away, she legally compelled the repatriation of those funds back into the Sterling Legacy Trust. As of Tuesday, the Zurich account holds exactly $0.00. Richard stared at Maya, his jaw hanging slightly open. The secret money, the untouchable fortress he had built for himself, the money he had planned to use to start a new life with Chloe if the divorce got messy. It was gone. She had found it, and she had taken it, legally and quietly, while he was sleeping right next to her. The courtroom was entirely still. Even the bailiff at the door stood motionless, captivated by the sheer, unadulterated dismantling of one of the city's most powerful men. Jonathan Creased sat heavily in his chair, dropping his gold Mont Blanc pen onto the table. He looked at Richard, then looked at the judge, and subtly shook his head. He was a fighter, a bulldog, but he knew when a war was over. There was no loophole, there was no hidden clause to exploit. Maya had spent almost 2 years weaving an inescapable web of ironclad contracts, trusts, and offshore entities. She had locked every door, barred every window, and then set the building on fire. Your Honor, Creased said quietly, the fight completely drained from his voice. The petitioner formally withdraws the motion for a temporary injunction. We have no further arguments at this time. Richard looked at his lawyer as if the man had just stabbed him in the back. What are you doing? Fight her. Hidden. Oh, bat over, Richard, Creased whispered harshly, leaning in so the microphones wouldn't pick it up. You signed away the company. You signed away your right to declare bankruptcy. You put your personal assets up as collateral, and she bought the debt. She holds all the cards. If you keep screaming, she's going to make sure you leave here with the clothes on your back and a mountain of legal fees you can no longer afford. Judge Davies nodded slowly, organizing the massive stack of documents on her bench. The court has reviewed the documentation regarding the Sterling Legacy Trust, the offshore transfer to Apex Sovereign Limited, and the subsequent debt acquisition, Judge Davies announced, her voice echoing with absolute finality. The respondent, Mrs. I. Maya Sterling, has operated entirely within the legal parameters established by the contracts signed by the petitioner. The court finds no evidence of fraud, coercion, or breach of fiduciary duty. She looked down at Richard, her expression stern but not unkind. Mr. Sterling, the law is not designed to protect you from the consequences of your own arrogant negligence. You gave your wife absolute control over your financial universe, and she utilized it. The emergency injunction is denied. The foreclosure proceedings initiated by Apex Sovereign Limited will proceed unimpeded. Arthur Pendleton stood up one last time. Your Honor, in light of the fact that the marital estate is now effectively consolidated under the trust which my client controls, we are prepared to offer a final, comprehensive divorce settlement to conclude these proceedings today. Richard didn't move. He just stared blankly at the mahogany table in front of him. Proceed, Mr. Pendleton, Judge Davies said. Mrs. Sterling is prepared to grant Mr. Sterling an immediate, uncontested divorce, Pendleton stated, reading from a single, crisp sheet of paper. Furthermore, Mrs. Sterling will generously forgive the remaining balance of the $600 million corporate debt that Mr. Kundrat Sterling currently owes to her offshore entity. Creased frowned, a glimmer of suspicion in his eyes. Forgive the debt? In exchange for what? No. In exchange for Mr. Sterling signing a quitclaim deed, surrendering his remaining minority shares in Sterling Holdings LLC, and legally vacating the primary residence in Wintedgar by 5 p.m. this Friday. Pendleton read. Furthermore, Mr. Sterling will forfeit any claim to the private aviation assets, the Hamptons property, and the contemporary art collection currently housed in the Chicago penthouse. And what exactly does my client walk away with? Creased asked, his tone bitter. Pendleton turned over the paper. Mrs. Sterling believes in honoring original agreements. Per the prenuptial agreement, Mr. Sterling insisted upon 15 years ago, back when he believed his wife was merely a temporary accessory, Mr. Burr. Sterling will receive a one-time, lump sum payment of $10 million. Not, Richard flinched. 10 million. To a man who had woken up that morning believing he was worth over $1 billion. $10 million was a rounding error. It was an insult. It was the exact amount he had once capped Maya's worth at, a cruel echo from their past. 10 million, Richard whispered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. My company is worth over $1 billion. Your company, Mr. Sterling, is currently insolvent, Pendleton corrected him sharply. Your wife's company is worth $1 billion. You are being offered a golden parachute. I strongly suggest you take it before my client decides to pursue the remaining debt and forces you into personal bankruptcy. Maya finally stood up. She buttoned the front of her Tom Ford suit. Picking up her leather Birkin bag from the table, she looked down at Richard, who was now a shattered, trembling reflection of the arrogant titan who had walked in 2 hours prior. You can keep your golf clubs, Richard, Maya said, her voice perfectly even, betraying no malice, no joy, and absolutely no regret. And I believe your assistant is currently looking for an apartment. I'm sure 10 million will afford you both a very comfortable, quiet life in the suburbs. She didn't wait for his response. Maya turned on her heel and walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open for her, and she stepped out into the marble hallway, leaving Richard Sterling sitting in the ruins of the empire she had built, and the empire she had just legally, brilliantly burned to the ground. Behind her, the sharp crack of Judge Davies' gavel echoed through the room one final time, sealing the fate of a man who had learned the hardest lesson of all: never underestimate the silent architect of your success. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 swung shut, cutting off the rhythmic, confident click of Maya's heels, but the sound seemed to echo in the stagnant air long after she was gone. Inside the room, the silence was absolute, heavy and suffocating. Richard Sterling remained frozen in his chair. He stared at the empty space where his wife, his executioner, had just been standing. He felt entirely hollowed out. A man who had just watched his own autopsy while still breathing. The billion-dollar empire, the private jets, the magazine covers hailing him as a real estate visionary. It was all gone, vaporized by the very woman he had treated as a background character in the movie of his life. Jonathan Creast, a lawyer who charged $1,500 an hour to win, violently snapped his leather briefcase shut. The sharp noise made Richard flinch. "Now, Jonathan," Richard croaked, his voice barely a whisper. "What do I do?" Creast didn't look at him with sympathy. He looked at him with the cold, professional detachment of a surgeon who had just called the time of death. He pulled the pristine divorce settlement and the quitclaim deeds from Arthur Pendleton's folder and slid them across the mahogany table. "You sign them, Richard," Creast said flatly. "You sign every single page right now before she changes her mind and decides to collect on the $600 million you technically owe her offshore company. If she does that, you won't just be broke. You'll be buried in federal litigation until you're 80. $10 million, Richard mumbled, staring at the paperwork as if it were coated in poison. "I have over $4 million in outstanding private loans and margin calls on my personal brokerage accounts. By the time I pay off my personal liabilities and your legal fees, I'll have almost nothing. Then I suggest you learn to budget," Creast replied ruthlessly, handing him a silver pen. "Sign the papers. I have other clients who actually read the contracts they sign." With a trembling hand, Richard took the pen. As he scratched his signature onto the signature lines, he wasn't just signing away his marriage. He was signing away his identity, his legacy, and his entire life's work. The ink bled into the paper, sealing his absolute ruin. By Friday afternoon, the reality of Richard's new existence had fully materialized. The sprawling 22-room Winnetka mansion, perched elegantly on the shores of Lake Michigan, was swarming with private security and moving personnel. However, the movers weren't there for Richard. They were there under strict instructions from Apex Sovereign Limited to carefully pack and transport Maya's extensive contemporary art collection, the antique Persian rugs, and the imported Italian furniture. Richard stood in the grand foyer, surrounded by towering stacks of cardboard boxes, clutching a single leather duffel bag. Per the court order, he was only permitted to take his personal clothing, his watches, and a set of golf clubs. He looked around the cavernous, echoing space that used to be his kingdom. It was completely stripped of warmth, stripped of the life Maya had breathed into it. He pulled out his cell phone, his hands still shaking slightly. He had been trying to reach Chloe for 3 days, ever since she had sprinted out of the courtroom, completely humiliated and stripped of her luxury apartment and car. She had gone radio silent. He dialed her number one last time, desperate for a familiar voice, desperate for the woman he had thrown everything away for. "We're sorry. The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." The automated voice was the final nail in the coffin. Chloe didn't love Richard Sterling, the 52-year-old man. She had loved Richard Sterling, the billionaire. Without the penthouse, the Cartier bracelets, and the Amalfi Coast vacations, he was just a middle-aged, unemployed man with a mountain of public humiliation attached to his name. She was gone and he was entirely, utterly alone. Promptly at 4:55 p.m., a towering security guard in a dark suit approached him. "Mr. Sterling, it's time to vacate the premises." The locks are being reprogrammed at 5 o'clock. Richard didn't argue. He didn't have the energy left to fight. He picked up his duffel bag, slung his golf clubs over his shoulder, and walked out the front door. He didn't have a driver waiting. He didn't have a sleek, luxury sedan. He had to call a rideshare service, standing on the curb of his own driveway like a trespasser, watching as a generic silver sedan pulled up to take him to a mid-range business hotel near the airport. 6 months later, the Chicago skyline looked exactly the same to the casual observer, but the power dynamics within it had completely shifted. High atop the newly rebranded Apex Spire, in a corner office that commanded a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the city and the lake, Maya Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. She wore a stunning, emerald-green tailored dress, her hair flowing perfectly over her shoulders. She held a cup of black coffee, watching the tiny ant-like cars navigate the streets far below. The transition had been flawless. The board of directors, initially shocked by the hostile takeover, had quickly fallen in line once they realized Maya possessed a financial brilliance that far exceeded her ex-husband's. She had stabilized the company's debt, secured new, highly profitable zoning permits, and increased the corporate valuation by 12% in just half a year. She was no longer the silent architect. She was the sole monarch. Her intercom buzzed softly. "Miss Sterling," her assistant's voice chimed in. The swaggering and truly noticed. "Is it ready for the acquisition meeting in boardroom A?" "Thank you, I'll be right there," Maya replied, her voice smooth and steady. She took one last sip of her coffee and looked out over the empire she had built, protected, and ultimately conquered. Richard had thought she was weak because she had pretended to be forgiving. He had thought her silence was submission. He had mistaken her grace for naivety. But as Maya turned away from the window and walked out to command a room full of the city's most powerful executives, she knew the truth. She hadn't just taken everything he owned, she had taken what was rightfully hers all along. What a spectacular, jaw-dropping conclusion to one of the most brilliant legal revenge strategies ever executed. Maya didn't just get mad, she got everything, leaving Richard with a measly 10 million and a broken ego, while his gold-digging mistress ran for the hills the second the money dried up. This is the ultimate proof that you should never underestimate the quiet, intelligent partner in a relationship. Because while you're playing games, they might just be buying the board. If you loved this intense, twist-filled story of absolute karma and brilliant strategy, please smash that like button and share this video with anyone who loves a good revenge tale. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. Let me know in the comments below what was the most satisfying moment of Maya's master plan for you.